Now to tonight's guest, Heather Zichal was President Obama's lead advisor on energy and climate change from 2009 until late last year. She's in Sydney this week as a guest of the United States Studies Centre to take part in the 2XEP Forum on Energy Productivity. And she joins us here in our studio. Heather Zichal, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Now, how do you lower carbon emissions without a carbon tax or even a floating price on carbon?
Well, in the United States, we've taken a number of measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we've done that looking at other tools aside from a carbon tax. What we've done is work specifically around the areas where we know we can achieve emissions reductions, the transportation sector, for example. The President worked very hard directly with the auto industry to come together and find a path forward to double the efficiency of our cars and trucks, 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025, which not only has a benefit of saving consumers at the pump, but driving greenhouse gas emissions down. We've also looked specifically at opportunities around the built environment, and the last piece, obviously, is what we do with our existing coal plants, and the President has a pretty aggressive plan there as well.
I'll come to that in a moment, but people describe this approach as sort of the silver buckshot approach rather than the silver bullet.
Right. Well, I've heard many different words to describe the plan, but I think what's really important here is that certainty and predictability, as well as taking into account the science, which tells us we need to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We know how to do that. We know that we can do it in a way that's affordable. We know that we can do it in a way that allows America to remain competitive. And we know that we can do it in a way that relies on existing technologies.
How fast is renewable energy growing because it still comprises a relatively small part of the energy production market?
While that's true, the good news, at least in America, is that we've been able to double the generation of renewables in just 4 short years. And as we've done that, we're not only deploying more renewables, we're also creating jobs in the process all along the supply chain. It's obviously a clean energy resource, which is terrific from a carbon and greenhouse gas perspective, but also conventional pollutants and the things that cause cancer and asthma. So the story there is quite tremendous, and I think the other added benefit that we've seen because we have had such a targeted focus around renewables is that the cost has come down significantly over time, making them more competitive with fossil fuel sources.
Well, let's go to what's been called the linchpin in the Obama plan. As we know, the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States and here in Australia is through power generation, power plants, often coal-fired power plants and dirty ones at that. The Obama plan is to give the Environmental Protection Agency the power to regulate carbon emissions from new and existing power plants. How will that happen and when will it start?
So I think, the actual authority that was given to the Environmental Protection Agency wasn't something new. That's been in the statute for decades. And in fact, the United States Supreme Court found that the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA as we call it in the United States, has the authority to go forward and regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So, the President made it very clear he was willing to work with Congress. He wanted to find a path forward. He put Democrat and Republican ideas on the table. Unfortunately, Congress wasn't willing to work with him. So the backup plan was to use these existing authorities to establish a standard, as you said, a carbon pollution standard for both new and existing facilities. The standard, obviously, in the United States, the notion that many companies were going to build new coal plants, especially with the regulatory uncertainty, that's not as big of an issue. The new plants, because there's not really a desire to build new coal plants in the United States, that's not as contentious of the issue as what do we do around the existing facilities. This summer, the Environmental Protection Agency will put a proposal out for public comment that will start a conversation about what the ultimate policy should look like for existing facilities. And I think the broader context here is that the President's goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 17% by 2020. And this is going to help us get there. But the other important piece is that we've already made so much progress in the United States. Our greenhouse gas emissions are going down. As I said earlier, the cost of renewables are also going down. So we have a very strong foundation from which to build.
Let's talk about this direct action policy, though, the regulation route. The idea is pretty simple, really. It's to treat carbon pollution as if it were a toxic pollutant in the same way that mercury or arsenic is a toxic pollutant. But you'll get arguments about that, won't you? I mean, you have people that say that carbon, CO2, is actually what makes plants grow.
Correct.
So how do you actually bridge that dichotomy?
Well, I think from President Obama's perspective, the science is clear and we need to act. So the question then becomes, what is it that we're going to do? What does this ultimate policy look like? And as I said, I think the Environmental Protection Agency is very much focused on how do we define an achievable standard that is going to drive those emissions reductions, do it in a way that's affordable, but also allows us to diversify our energy sector, and achieve those environmental benefits that are so incredibly important.
Okay, but let's get to practicalities. How do you imagine it will work? I mean, when you put these regulations on an existing coal-fired power plant, for example, does it mean someone will say, well, you can emit this much, and beyond that we'll start imposing penalties on you?
Well, the good thing about the Clean Air Act is that it is incredibly flexible, and that the United States has a long history of using this law to drive down reductions of other pollutants, whether that's mercury or NOx or SO2 or any of the other number of pollutants regulated under the Act. The proposal has yet to be public, but I think going back to those flexibilities, rather than a plant-by-plant standard, the Act affords the administration to think a little bit differently about how they might regulate this. And in fact, you could imagine a scenario where we are establishing a state-by-state budget, carbon budget, if you will, that each individual state has to meet. And they can do that through a variety of different mechanisms, whatever, knowing that each state is a little bit different. So energy efficiency measures, natural gas, renewables, what that combination ultimately looks like to allow that state to get to that budget provides flexibility, allows a state to take into consideration cost differentials, and
This is going to mean the states, including Republican states, are going to have to be on side with this, and we know the Republican Congress is virulently opposed to this. In fact, they say this is nothing more than a war on coal.
Correct, and I think the administration is very clear-eyed about the fact that they are going to face opposition in the federal government at the state level, but I think it gets back to this primary belief that now we need to act to drive these emissions reductions. We know we have tools to do that, and I don't think the president wants to be in a position where he leaves office in 2016 and says, well, I could have done that, but it just seemed really hard politically. I think this is a fight he believes is worth fighting.
But there will be political consequences, won't there? Because if you reduce the amount of emissions from certain coal-fired power stations, for example, they'll put up their prices. Electricity will become more expensive, and we'll see the kind of political bun fight we've had in this country over rising political prices as a result of effectively putting restrictions on carbon emissions.
Every single thing this president has tried to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions has been met with some contention, and whether that was the work around the fuel economy standards for cars and trucks, the historic investments in renewables and energy efficiency, but he's prevailed at every step of the way, and I think that's largely because the American people recognize the benefits of diversifying your energy portfolio, understand that energy efficiency means you're driving costs down, and that's good for your pocketbook. And ultimately, as Americans are facing more extreme weather patterns, understanding what climate change means for them, there's broad recognition that that climate change is having an impact today, and that there's a cost associated with that. So these are investments worth making.
Yeah. So effectively, you're saying it's a carbon price by another name, imposed effectively by regulation. And that obviously won't escape the attention of Republicans. So what's going to happen? Will the EPA have the teeth to impose strict rules when emitters or even states say, oh, we can't do this, it's too expensive?
Absolutely. They will have the teeth, and they will have the president backing them.
Now, you're credited with being the architect, or one of the key architects of this plan, and yet you actually have left your position late last year before this linchpin is put in place. I mean, did you not have the stomach for the fight, or do you think the politics is going to get too bitter around this?
Well, my reasons for leaving were 100% personal, and I think that the president is well positioned, has an incredibly strong team around him, and I'm fully confident that this broader plan that includes both domestic action at home to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, a focus on helping communities prepare for a changing climate, as well as engaging in the international community, because as we all know, no one country can solve this challenge alone. It's going to take the collective efforts of many to meet those emissions reduction targets that the scientists tell us we need to.
We have a big meeting coming up in Paris about that, and I'll talk about that in a little while. But first of all, one key aspect of this, obviously, is the huge boom in natural gas production in the United States. And I suppose that one of the things you're hoping that will happen is that those dirtier power stations will transition to coal. That was the idea here in Australia as well. Is that part of the plan? Is that part of the process of transitioning to a cleaner form of burning energy?
Absolutely. Natural gas has a very important role to play in the U.S. domestic energy portfolio. In fact, today it's helped us drive emissions down in the power sector, which is clearly a good thing. But I would also say a couple things about natural gas itself. First and foremost, it needs to be developed safely and responsibly. That means aggressive regulations on air emissions, on water quality, as well as standards to protect communities in the process of that development. And the second piece of this is, as important as natural gas is going to be, getting back to this silver buckshot analogy, we can't put all of our eggs in the natural gas basket. We need to invest and double down on energy efficiency. We need to be building out renewables. And, look, I think there are technologies out there that are yet to be discovered that are going to help us drive down emissions. And so that last piece is continuing investment in research and development.
One of the things, however, that's actually helped you do this is restrictions on the amount of natural gas that can be exported, turned into LNG and exported from the United States. There are export restrictions. They don't have those export restrictions here in Australia, so the promised transition from coal to gas power transmission hasn't actually happened, or power generation, I should say, hasn't actually happened. If those restrictions are lifted in the United States, will that be a problem?
Well, I don't see the restrictions being lifted. I think
the WTO seems to have a different idea about this. I mean, the free trade rules could come into play here.
Right. Notwithstanding WTO issues, I think that the path that the administration is on recognizes that there is an important role for natural gas exports to play in the U.S. in terms of job creation and trade balance. But the process that the U.S. has gone through has included very robust analysis to make sure we understand the domestic impacts that we'll have on the manufacturing sector, on American consumers. And right now there are over 20 applications pending with the Department of Energy to export natural gas.
And the manufacturers screaming, "Don't do it."
Exactly. And I think that the administration's perspective is they need to take a very cautious, stepwise approach. They need to look at each individual permit and make a decision based on that application, and they're continuing to do additional analysis the whole time, making sure that they understand what that looks like and what that means for the American economy.
Okay, let's go finally to the meeting that's going to happen in Paris. It's the next climate convention, the UN climate convention, and the last one, of course, was in Copenhagen, and that was a complete disaster, largely because the United States and China were the world's two biggest emitters, were intransigent about committing to emissions reduction targets. Will that change, at least from the United States perspective, this time round?
Well, I think the president is very focused on making sure that changes. And if you look at what the United States government has done to try and engage China along the way, and not just looking at the Conference of Parties in 2015, but looking at other fora to drive discussions about reductions in carbon pollution, We've actually been met. We have some real success under our belt, which is terrific news. In fact, the agreement around hydrofluorocarbons, another very dangerous and potent greenhouse gas, that we entered into with both China and India has been huge in terms of what it means for our ability to work with China. We are doing some joint work around carbon capture and sequestration and other technologies. So I think that there's a lot of work that's been done to foster that relationship heading into 2015.
Finally, well, John Kerry has said, unless we act dramatically and quickly, science tells us our climate and our way of life are literally in jeopardy. So his rhetoric will be on the line in Paris. Do we know yet what concrete emissions reduction target the United States will go and put on the table?
They're in the process of developing that, like many other countries. Today, as I said, the president's goal is a 17% emissions reduction target by 2020. Consistent with the Warsaw Compact, now each country is working to develop their post-2020 targets. We expect those to, trickle out over time, and I think in early 2015 you can expect to hear from the U.S. about their commitments.
Heather Zichal, we thank you very much for taking the time to come and talk to us tonight. Have fun in Australia.
Thank you.